Welcome to this special episode of Gatekeeper, and today we're honored to have former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo with us. Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming on the show.
It's wonderful to be with you.
And my co-host for this episode is Mike Doran, familiar to the audience of this podcast, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Gadi. Hello, Mr. Secretary.
Good to be with you, my esteemed Hudson colleague.
Mr. Secretary, I thought we could start with our region, where people are now very anxious about the future U.S. policy. But first, looking back, U.S. policy in the Middle East under your tenure as Secretary of State had undeniable success. How would you characterize what you did differently compared to previous administrations?
Well, we came at this fresh. Three central understandings, I think, drove our policy in the broader Middle East. First, it began with the central fact of Iran as the destabilizing force in the region. We accepted that as fact and worked forward from there. This was different than the previous administration that had turned to Iran and thought that it could, increase relationships and engage with them and make them less anti-Semitic, less terror-prone, less prepared to move down a path towards a nuclear program. We knew that was all just hogwash and acted accordingly. Second, we weren't prepared to permit, frankly, 40 years of bipartisan policy, which had given the Palestinians essentially a veto over so much of the stability and peace in the region, and nations wanting to work together. And we said, well, we're going to lay out our vision for peace. We're going to make a presentation about what could make life better for the Palestinians. But in the event they reject it, so be it. We're moving forward. And then finally, we understood, too, that we needed to keep our military capacity to deny terrorists a capacity to operate in the region. So whether that was sanctions on Iran to deny the Houthis money and resources, or Hezbollah or the Shia militias, we made Iranian leaders have a tougher call. And then we worked with a big coalition to defeat ISIS, to conclude the campaign against the caliphate there in Syria. We had some real successes. There's always more work to do. But those were the things that undergirded the way that President Trump and our administration thought about making America more secure by our actions in the Middle East.
On the subject of, sorry, Gadi.
No, go ahead, Mike.
On the subject of more work to do, could you say a few words about the Saudi-Israeli relations? I mean, that was as the Trump administration came to a close, that was my personal biggest disappointment. That relationship didn't move formally to another level. I know that there's a lot you can't say about it, but could you give us any context and maybe suggest what you think steps the two could take now to, if not go to a formal peace, at least move things to another level?
Yeah, Mike, I don't want to get too far into the details of where we left off and what we were discussing, but there are a couple things that are unambiguously true. I think the leadership in Saudi Arabia understands that there will come a date and a time when the right thing will be to recognize Israel as the rightful homeland of the Jewish people and make their country better, make Israel better, make the region more stable by proceeding down a path similar to what the Abraham Accords prescribe. I'm very confident. I think the direction of travel is all good. Always with these things, and we found this with the 4 agreements that moved forward, timing is always impossible to predict. And while I, too, wish that we would have gotten 6 or 8 or 10 instead of 4, I think the foundations of what we did have demonstrated it's the right thing. And then I think even what you see going on today, right? Businessmen traveling back and forth between Bahrain and the Emirates and Israel, diplomatic relationships, embassies opening. Kosovo opened their embassy in Jerusalem this week. This is great stuff. And this was all because leaders made good decisions, and they knew the United States was going to be supportive of those decisions. You can't have one without the other, but together, I think they portend well, and I think the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will find its path forward as well.
Is there a danger that these achievements will now be undone or frayed by by the new attitude or the old attitude that the Biden administration seems to be harboring towards Iran?
Gadi, I've been around long enough to know that saying never is something one should avoid at all at all costs. But it does seem unimaginable to me. While I'll concede this administration is going to take a very different approach to the region than we did, I think people in the region have come to expect that this is a one-way ratchet and that these relationships will only expand and increase. I think people will see their lives are better. And when their lives are better, they're going to say, goodness gracious, why would we go back to being hostile towards Israel? Why, the lexicon, right? The idea of the Arab-Israeli conflict, you just don't hear about it much anymore. I always remarked, we don't hear much about, OPEC and the Arab-Israeli conflict, ideas from the 70s and the 80s and 90s. And while each of them still exists, there's still conflict, and OPEC is still out there and caused a hiccup there for a moment in the oil markets. The world has just changed so much, whether it's American energy independence and our capacity to ship LNG all around the world, or the work that's been done by the Israelis to improve their security relationships with these Gulf states. These are things that are unambiguous goods. Good for these countries, the people of those countries, good for the United States. It seems hard to imagine that any of those countries would retrench from things that are working for their citizens.
The thing that, I think that the greatest thing that you guys did was developed a new model for a kind of continued serious American engagement in the region, particularly in the questions of security, while minimizing the use of U.S. ground forces. And it was a very serious containment of Iran. I thought the operation to kill Qasem Soleimani, I know that was very popular in Israel. It was very popular in my home. And I think there's no previous administration. I know this from working in the Bush administration. We wouldn't have contemplated it. I wonder if you could. I think you probably had a special responsibility in that. In the development of that architecture, because you went from the CIA to the State Department. And I wonder if you could just give us a sense of the thinking. Were you guys consciously saying to yourselves, we need to square the circle between the need to be deeply engaged and on the one hand, and the demand of the American electorate on the other, that we not have large numbers of troops? Or did this thing just kind of unfold as, on its own as you were under those pressures?
Mike, that's a really great question. The truth is we fought over this issue every day. We thought hard about this for a long time. The president had made a commitment in his campaign, right? And the endless wars was the shorthand for it. But this was a deep commitment that says we want to think about this differently. We do want to put fewer of our young men and women in harm's way. And yet we've got this responsibility, this thing that matters to the American people, our security. How do you accomplish those? Afghanistan was the same thing. Mike, the mission was very clear from the president. Mike, I want our troops reduced in Afghanistan, and I don't want any terror coming from there. Do them both. And so we were very conscious of these dueling, competing objectives, and we needed to get each of them across the line. When it comes to the strike on Qasem Soleimani, look, I'd known about this guy since I was in Congress. I knew that he personally was responsible for the death of friends of mine. I also knew that he continued to be a unique leader. We sometimes think that if we take down a terror leader that will accomplish a bunch, they just replace him with someone else. This was a fellow who was unique. This was sui generis. There's no replacement for what Qasem Soleimani delivered. He was of special importance. And I think when we ultimately built out the set of understandings and the operational capability to do this, and then could see that he was to the very day, plotting to continue to kill Americans, that we were able to present this to the president. He made a very bold decision to go conduct that operation. I think the world took notice. I think the world took notice about how the Trump administration would respond when threatened. I think the world took notice that we had a team that could execute on behalf of America. I tip my hat to the individuals that were involved in that operation. It was incredibly well executed. And I think to your point, I think Israelis were happy. I think Arab countries were happy. I think the Iranian people were very happy as well. This was the right outcome. I remember a hearing where we were being criticized for this by folks in the opposing party. I still scratch my head about how anyone could think that the world is worse off as a result of the actions that we took that day.
And also the timing was amazing, because I remember it being the time when Iran was getting cocky. It was, I think they attacked a fuel tanker. I think they were getting more and more confident in this Middle Eastern kind of, we have been around 3,000 years and have been cheating diplomats for that long. So it was, but now I'm not sure we can count on such bold actions. And, Israel has said emphatically that it would not allow a nuclear Iran. Does that mean we might be on a collision course with an American administration now?
Gadi, I hope not. Not only can Israel not tolerate an Iran with a nuclear weapon, the world can't. Certainly the United States couldn't. We made very clear. I can't tell you how many times President Trump made it abundantly clear. We were doing that for two reasons. One, it was the right policy. Second, we wanted the Iranian regime to understand that it just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen on our watch. And we were serious about that. The tools to prevent that are many and legion. We used our economic tools, our maximum pressure campaign. We used our diplomatic tools to try to build out as big a coalition between Arab states and Israelis to push back against Iran as we could. But we were prepared to use everything that the United States had. And the president made this clear to make sure they never had a nuclear weapon. Imagine, Gadi, just for a second, imagine an Iran on the cusp of a nuclear weapon or a nuclear weapons program, let alone actually having one. Their capacity to extort, their capacity to use their, either emerging capability or actual capability against the region, they make clear their intention. It is an imperialist revolutionary regime with theocratic revolutionary mindset. And it's made clear they want to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. We should accept that proposition, that they are intent upon that. They repeat it often. That means that the United States has a responsibility to be sure that we're doing everything we can. And deterrence matters. The Iranians understand appeasement and they understand strength, and they know the difference between the two. And so I hope this administration won't head down a path which signals to the Iranians that their continued efforts won't meet an American opposition and an American set of costs being imposed upon them.
I heard from somebody who worked with you that you had actually very strong opinions about UNIFIL in Lebanon, and that you saw this within the context of Iran. But we don't talk much about it here. I think maybe the Israelis have a bigger interest in this question. Can you give us a little background to the UNIFIL debate and what your position was on it?
Sure. That's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before, because it's a little bit in the weeds, but nonetheless really important to this set of issues that surround the greater Middle East and peace. Full disclosure, I have a special love for the people of Lebanon. There's a huge Lebanese community in the district I represented in South Central Kansas. I've been there several times. It's this most wonderful, amazing place, and it's been destroyed by the Iranian regime and the infighting, the political infighting that has resulted therefrom. UNIFIL was put in place with a mission that said they're going to be peacekeepers. And of course, sadly, they do nothing of the sort. We talked about this in the Trump administration a lot. Hey, we're fine to be part of an entity that's actually executing its mission. We'll contribute. We'll do our part. But if we see something that's not working, for goodness sakes, we ought to call it out for the failure that it is and stop lending American resources to it. I tried to do that. I was unsuccessful. There were lots of different views, frankly, within the State Department and the administration about this. The Israelis, too, are cautious. They've been there a while. There's blue helmets on the ground. You probably don't get it's probably not. It probably actually generates some benefit, but my judgment ultimately was that the costs grossly exceeded the benefits, and it seemed that a wind down or a reduction in the scale and size of UNIFIL would have been completely appropriate. I hope this administration could take a good hard look at it, and if they come to the same conclusion I did, they'll redirect American resources to create security in the region in another way.
Mr. Secretary, one last question. We understand you're out of time. Your signature policy, I think, has to do with China, and turning around for the trends of China's attempt at hegemony. Where do you see the future of U.S.-Chinese relations heading in the broadest sense?
I'll try and connect these conversations too. We often talk about the Middle East and then go to China. Just as a side note, we should be mindful that the Chinese intentions in the Middle East are real and growing. And so I spoke with my Israeli friends. I spoke with my Gulf state friends about the threat that China posed to their nations as well. Their efforts to infiltrate and to colonialize are real and everywhere, and that certainly includes the Middle East. More broadly for the United States, the Chinese Communist Party represents frankly, the single greatest existential threat. It's complicated by the fact that we have enormous economic interests. Our economies are deeply intertwined. But I always remind people that they are a heck of a lot more dependent on the United States and China than the American people are on them. And that gives us leverage, capacity, power, the chance to influence Chinese Communist Party behavior. And we ought to use that. It won't be costless. You saw this, right? When the president put tariffs in place, there's a real impact in the United States. I think that's why for 40 years plus, no president had prepared to actually impose costs on China for their malign activity. But I think the world can see this now. I'm proud of the work we did. I remember my first trip to Europe to talk about Huawei. I left the room and not a single person gave me so much as a golf clap. It was completely silent. And I couldn't decide whether to be embarrassed or proud, somewhere between maybe. But the truth of the matter is we shared with them these risks. We were just talking about facts, the things that I think everyone has now come to accept about what China is up to. And for that, we deserve an awful lot of credit in my judgment. But put aside the credit, what we have done is we've now laid a foundation for this administration to build upon that says we can no longer look the other way and turn the other cheek and think that when the Chinese say win-win, it surely must be so. Indeed, when they say win-win, it is almost certainly win for them and lose for us. And while there are so many things we could talk about, that global larger picture is something I believe the world is now aware of, concerned about, and collective action to respond to the Chinese Communist Party's threat, I think, is something that every administration will have to deal with.
They just might be trying to eat your lunch. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for your time and for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. So long.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Mike.